Hype, anticipation, new region, new characters, and a completely new facet of Genshin's story. Nod Krai is gearing up to make or break Genshin's narrative direction. But all of this build-up brought back some concerns that reminded me of how Inazuma had went as a release, and how the glaring errors of their Archon Quest had kinda decimated some people's opinion on how Genshin's story developed and Inazuma as a region had been perceived. So, I want to talk about how Nod Krai can end up massively failing if they were to fall into the same pits that Inazuma did. Because mind you, it says something about how underdeveloped Inazuma's story was when people are still willing to put it far below Natlan even with all the vocal criticism that was levied against it. Of course, before we talk about Nod Krai itself, we're gonna have to talk about what made Inazuma's Archon Quest absolutely crap the bed to the point where it kinda overshadowed the fact that the region in itself is actually pretty well executed. And as per usual, spoiler alert for, of course, the Inazuma storyline, and I guess other Archon Quest storylines in general. To begin it all, there is no better place to start than to discuss what preluded all the chaos before Inazuma's release, and why is it that I ended up drawing some parallels with the way Nod Krai is shaping up. Inazuma was the first full region added to the game after the mainland of Mondstadt and Liyue became the center of the game's release geography. It was based off of Japan, so naturally ACG fans are already hyped for it. Players were starving for something new other than the two OG regions. There were characters like Ayaka, who had been in the closed beta, so she was highly anticipated for, and the presence of other characters such as A and Yae Miko, who are both not entirely XPs, but definitely designed around the same principles as Raiden Mei and Yae Sakura, who are popular characters from Hoyo's previous franchises, and the mere notion of even more story progression was enough for most players to expect a lot out of the region. So, what ended up happening? Well, two things. For starters, the Archon Quest was short in acts. Hoyo thought that they could still treat Inazuma's arc like a setup and only gave them 3 acts, which is the same amount of acts that the two setup regions, Mondstadt and Liyue, got for their Archon Quest. The extension of this problem was that they were trying to do too much in the span of just 3 acts, and ended up leaving most things rushed and just outright incomplete. Well, okay, we technically got 4 with the Kazuha prologue, but that barely did anything in the grand scheme of Inazuma's own questline. The shortness of these Archon quest lines were alright for Mondstadt and Liyue because we were still trying to get into grips with everything, and people generally didn't have that high of an expectation to begin with since it is the early days where the writing wasn't all that fleshed out. But obviously, that same lenient expectation wasn't about to be applied to Inazuma. And number 2, the plot in general makes sense, but the way the main characters acted throughout the questline was dubious, criminally underexplored, and ironically, out of character in regards to how the characters itself had been set up in the arcs. Not that there was much time to do that to begin with. Remember, 3 acts. Particularly, the problem lies within these 2 supposed leaders of the nation. We'll talk about Kokomi first because, contrary to A, we had an expectation of what sort of role A would have before we got anything about Inazuma. Kokomi was a blank slate, but once we got into the story, we know one very general thing about this, well, general. She is a damn good strategist. So much so that she is able to handle being Watatsumi's divine priestess, all while being a general that was going up against probably one of the more decorated military individuals in Tevat's history. And not only that, she was supposedly someone who can stand toe-to-toe against the military prowess of the shogunate army. So, personally, I was expecting some great military back and forth between the shogunate and the rebellion commanded under Kokomi. Lo and behold, what did we get? One kind of major clash between the two armies, in which the shogun herself was not involved, but I guess that's fine since we did get to see a clash between 2 generals. Kokomi swooped in with a bit of communism, got the rebels out of sight, only to go back to her island and discover that she herself is in another tight spot, with shortage of general resources and supplies being the major problem that her people are now dealing with. And, being the great strategist that she is, we would think that she'd find a cool and ingenious way of dealing with that supply issue and that we'd help her along. Not at figuring it out because that's really not our job, but, to smooth things out along the way. Right? Right? Wrong. What did she decide to do? Receive quote-unquote help from a mysterious sponsor when she has no way of verifying who they are, and all the communication that they had before that was merely a letter that pretty much told Kokomi to keep on fighting the shogunate. A supposed great strategist, yet is so willing to receive supplies her men are going to use without attempting to run a thorough check on who these people are and what exactly the entirety of these supplies actually encompass. So, was it really a surprise to me when Kokomi suddenly had to also deal with the fact that Fatui-made delusions have infiltrated her ranks and are beginning to cause a concerning amount of her soldiers slowly whittle themselves down because they do not have the constitution to be using a delusion? No real surprise there. That's why, for me at least, as much as they tried to make an emotional meatball out of our friendship with Teppei, it just didn't hit me as hard as it could have. Because a part of me the whole time was still thinking, well, what did you really expect? I've not been in any war, but I don't think you're supposed to trust mysterious gifts or supplies being sent by God knows who, and more so, utilize whatever it is that they sent without verifying their use case first and foremost, especially when it's not just food and money that you're using. Even when France secretly helped the US during the Revolutionary War, it wasn't the French just suddenly sending supplies out of nowhere. They needed to officially, while still maintaining its covert nature, establish that connection first and foremost. Imagine how differently it would have turned out for the rebellion if they'd run the delusions by the Traveler first. They could have just taken the other secure supplies and thrown away the delusions. They trusted the Traveler enough to start leading a platoon, why not just run their resources by them as well? And no, before you guys say, but they were desperate, can't blame Kokomi for that. No amount of desperation will eventually justify the fact that her men got screwed over by her flawed initiative. You're leading up. You're gonna be the one to bear the brunt of the blame. Of course, it also didn't help that her soldiers were stressed out for power because they've been getting their ass handed to them by the shogunate, but that would just be more reason to be more wary about mysterious weapons suddenly giving you steroids out of nowhere. The setup to Kokomi's character just ended up not mattering at all. For a brilliant strategist, her highlight arc in the story came from a time where she made an inarguably dumb decision. Now, the second half of the arc's lacklusterness came from the shogun herself. Like I said, the arc was flying by quickly. We swiftly went from just trying to get past Rito, getting shot on by the shogun, being a part of the rebellion, finding out their screw-up, getting saved by Yae from A's emo son, and immediately going up against the shogun again, this time with the power of friendship and a bit of dodge training coached by Yae herself. While we have the big picture now, during the arc itself, we barely know anything detailed about why A ended up doing what she did to her nation. Yes, she explained that it was because she had lost so many of her closest friends and her sister, but it really wasn't reason enough for her to A. pretty much imprison her nation for a whole year, and B. ignore the actions of the Fatui just because she thought it was aligning with her vision of eternity. A lot of people in the A camp likes to say, oh, but the Fatui was deceiving her via the Kujo family, so it wasn't her fault that they were able to go around her back and cause some suffering to the people of Inazuma. She didn't know. But that's really the whole shtick about responsibility, isn't it? She's leading a nation for Archon's sake. If you can't be meticulous when it comes to allowing a suspicious organization operating that freely in your nation, then you're just being an ignorant leader. If all it took to deceive the shogun was to give a false report, then by all means, she's a terrible leader. Just because she didn't know does not erase the fact that it happened. The biggest threat to eternity is an end, and for any one of her people, the end is when they die. People were losing ambitions because their visions were taken away, and in a sense, like the game was implying, losing their visions basically equates to the end of their lives. It just ends up going against what A was trying to achieve, and we honestly didn't get too much exposition in terms of how the people ended up readjusting to the complete 180 that A ended up doing. No talks or showcase of how the community ended up recovering. No showcases of what the community thought of the Sakoku decree and how A ended up directly making it right with their people. The arc just sort of faded away. A did a teehee, whoops, the decree was probably not at all a good idea, and things just kinda went back to normal. Other than A having to solve the whole Kujo Fatui collusion plot, and even that wasn't done within the Archon Quest arc, and rather had to take place in A's character story quest, which was preluded mostly by like a date session between A and the Traveler. Gotta sell the characters first, am I right? Accountability to the people was pretty much non-existent, and when we needed a moment where A actually talks to the people and recognizes her flaws, we never really got that. People also want to argue that, oh, the Vision Hunt decree only really affected Vision users, which is not much of the populace, so technically, the majority didn't really get affected by the Vision Soul problem thing. Really? You're saying that if you have someone close to you who is literally mentally incapacitated by something the government did, you wouldn't want to go and help that person and you're fine with letting them live just like that? Come on now. Inazuma's Archon Quest arc ended in version 2.1, which is a no-brainer as to why there are so many things left unexplored in the narrative. 2.2 and 2.3 ended up being some pretty empty patches when it comes to the story, and 2.4 was Lantern Rite. It took until 2.5 before I can finally say that Inazuma's narrative was complete, because I will always say that without 2.5, Inazuma would probably be the worst narratively written region by a mile. And even with 2.5, it just about managed to salvage Inazuma as something that did end up making sense story-wise. But still, it took a long while, and at that point, many people already threw away their stocks on Inazuma's story being any good. Without a second story quest and the whole revelation of the Shogun robot rejecting her and having Makoto's whole posthumous plan be revealed, a lot of people probably still thought that A did not need to enact that whole decree in the first place. Having a lot of the emotional focal point of the story be anchored on an NPC that doesn't really have much of a stake in the grand scheme of things also didn't help. Teppei was, I guess, fine and all, though it may have inadvertently showcased the traveler's ignorances. I'm pretty sure a whole lot of the player base recognized that a delusion was what is causing his deteriorating health much faster than when the story finally got there. But also, comparatively, when we look at the arcs after Inazuma, it was clear that utilizing NPCs to be vocal emotional points has its way of working, just not the Teppei way. Sumeru had Ruka de Huta, Fontaine had Fusiliers and by extension Melus and Silver, while Natlan technically had Capitano and the past remnants of Natlan warriors, but mostly had a good portion of its emotional focal point anchored on the Archon herself. Putting it on a, well, sorry to say, rather random NPC was never going to make its narrative impact last all that long, no matter how hard you try to keep it in your heart. These are the things that I genuinely hope that Nod Krai can outright avoid, because if you were to compare how Nod Krai is currently being built up, then you'd probably notice that there are a lot of similarities when it comes to what Inazuma was bringing to the table way back when. They are promising an evolution of Genshin storytelling. They are bringing an entirely new region that only got a smidge of a tease beforehand. They are utilizing characters that have been established names in the game for quite a while and have garnered massive popularity behind them, despite not being official playable characters such as Varka, Alice, and Columbina. They are coming into Nod Krai after a relatively disappointing Natlan, at least in comparison to the general consensus surrounding Sumeru and Fontaine. So there are a lot of expectations riding into it to bring the story back up to speed. And since they have promised to make Nod Krai become that bridge for people who haven't been able to keep up with the story to actually catch up, it would be immensely detrimental to the outlook of the story if it ends up not doing just that to begin with. How they conduct the usage of Varka will be highly scrutinized. How they utilize the Hex and Circle mages and Alice as a character playing a direct role will also be highly scrutinized, not to mention Columbina and Sandrone. Much more so if they try to bring in some other very lightly teased characters such as, I don't know, Jean's mother and, oh actually parents, I forgot that, Seamus Pegg is also in that expedition. They have to get so many things fundamentally and narratively right, and because of how they handled Capitano's role and story in Natlan, people aren't exactly wrong to have major doubts. I for one wouldn't mind if they decided to dedicate a lot of the patches in Nod Krai to better space out the chapter's acts. Heck, if they decided that they want to put more acts, then I'm also all for it. It's been kind of my opinion that having the region's Archon Quest pretty much end at the X.2 patch of said region just feels like a massive waste, as they could have used it for a bit more exposition. Natlan was the first nation to have their region's Archon Quest arc end at the X.3 patch, but that's because they had an additional regional Archon Quest interlude chapter instead of it just being a regular interlude chapter like the Chasm storyline. Because bar the Traveler quest and that one patch that they will use to expand or add a sub-area, the rest of the patches are used for large-scale events such as Lantern Rite, your Mondstadt specials, that then becomes the reason to detract away from the story of that current region. I think Nod Krai should forgo that formula for this one and try to at least consistently provide something new in relation to the region itself in most, if not all, of the lunar patches. Of course, Lantern Rite is inevitable, but seeing as there are Knights of Avunius in the region, maybe they can make it so that the Knights there and Varka have some sort of celebration that they do for those who are in expeditions, like a portable Ludi Harpastum or whatever. That's not even considering if Dormant Port is ever gonna be a thing in these lunar patches. They need to flesh everything out the moment it needs to be fleshed out. None of us are having the repeat of Inazuma where the story ended in 2.1 and had only been fully fleshed out by character story quest in 2.5. That kind of mistake would just push people who are coming into the patch to catch up away from even understanding anything about Nod Krai, let alone the rest of the story itself. They have a lot of characters coming up for Nod Krai, and I expect all of them to be utilized whenever they can be utilized. Pawning off vital narrative driving plot elements on pure NPCs will never be what anyone wants, not when a playable character, or a character that has a much larger and longer lasting relevance to the main story, can fill that role. Leave no loose ends that won't be a main story plot going forward, because having loose ends in an arc that was supposed to tie up the loose ends just becomes a useless and idiotic paradox. And for the love of God, stick to your character setups. It really doesn't matter if that setup ended up being kinda wonky, but if they're consistent with it, at least they are still writing a character that would eventually be able to stand on its own, instead of just making one that is only there to serve as plot tools that doesn't have its own inherent character. There will be time to make any setup work with a character so long as their development just doesn't end up going against what makes that character in the first place. The Star Wars sequels had a great setup in Force Awakens, but everything just became shit due to how they decided to work the story from then on. We don't need a prodigious general making obviously questionable military decisions, and if Alice ain't blowing shit up from minute one, then that would be, well, I guess sort of understandable, because despite the memes, I'd like to think that she's not an absolute terrorist, but it would also make complete sense for her to do so since, well, she's nuts. This is the same person who would have leveled Star Snatch Cliff if Kaya didn't say no, and also kind of massacred some Hilitrils in an attempt to control a Ruin Guard, which is yeah, I'll leave you guys to think about that. And you know what? We've waited years for her to actually show up, so why not come in with a bang? That's it for this video. Thanks for watching as per usual. I'm writing the script before the Lunar 1 version livestream comes out, so if there's anything from there that I probably should have brought up here, well, that's just gonna have to wait for a different time. Until the next video, the name's Leafy, and I'll see you all next time. Sayonara.